Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones nobody can see. Sometimes it takes another broken soul to help us heal. Jedediah Cain had been living alone in the mountains for 10 years, ever since he buried his faithful dog, Dusty, the old mountain. Man had sworn off all company after that loss cut him deeper than any blade. But one spring day, in a dusty town, he saw something that changed everything. A little pup, mean and snarling, fighting against his rope like he hated the whole world. Everyone had given up on the angry little thing. "I haven't seen such an aggressive puppy in 10 years, Jed said quietly. Then he did something nobody expected. He untied that rope and walked the pup straight up into the mountains. What made a lonely hermit see something special in an angry, unwanted pup? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a weathered sentry against the mountainside, its hand-hewn logs darkened by decades of snow and sun. Jedediah Cain had built it with his own calloused hands 23 years ago, back when he still believed in permanence and the possibility of shared tomorrows. Now it stood as a monument to solitude, every beam and board a testament to a man who had chosen isolation over the risk of loss. From his front porch, Jed could see the entire Bitterroot Valley spread. Below, like a patchwork quilt stitched together by God's own hand. Pine forests rolled down the mountainsides in waves of deep green, broken by meadows that turned gold in autumn and white in winter. On clear mornings, he could make out the thin ribbon of smoke rising from the town of Cedar Falls, 12 miles. Down the winding mountain road, it might as well have been 1,200 miles for all the connection he felt to the folks down there. The morning ritual never changed. Coffee first, black as midnight and strong enough to wake the dead. Then a slow walk around the property, checking his trap lines and noting the signs left by the mountain's other inhabitants. Deer tracks near the creek, bear scat by the berry. Bushes, the delicate prints of foxes who hunted the meadow mice. He read the mountain like other men read newspapers, finding in its daily changes all the conversation he needed. On the east side of the cabin, beneath the spreading branches of an ancient pine, lay a small grave marked by a simple wooden cross. No name adorned it, just 2 dates carved deep into the weathered wood: 2005, 2015. 10 years. A decade since he'd laid Dusty to rest under that tree, the old golden retriever who had been his constant companion through the hardest years of his life. Even now, passing that spot each morning, Jed felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the hollow ache that time had dulled but never healed. Dusty had found him first, not the other way around. A scraggly pup abandoned at a rest stop outside. Billings, all ribs and hope, following Jed to his truck with the determination of a creature who recognized kindred loneliness. For 10 years, that dog had been his shadow, his confidant, his reason to come home each evening. When the cancer took him, slow and merciless despite Doc Henderson's best efforts, it took something from Jed that he'd sworn never to replace. The townspeople of Cedar Falls knew Jedediah Cain, though few could claim to truly know him. Once a month, he'd make the journey down the mountain in his battered Ford pickup, the truck bed loaded with pelts and preserves to trade at Martha's General Store. Martha Hutchins had run that store for 37 years, watching Cedar Falls grow from a logging camp to a modest mountain town that attracted its share of tourists and retirees seeking the slower pace of mountain life. "Morning, Jed," Martha would call out as he stepped through the screen door, the bell announcing his arrival with its familiar jangle. She was a woman of perhaps 60, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of practical kindness that mountain communities bred. "Coffee's fresh if you want a cup while we settle up." Their conversations followed a comfortable pattern, touching on weather and wildlife, the health of mutual acquaintances, the state of the mountain roads. Martha never pried, understanding instinctively that some men carried their stories close to the vest, but she worried about him, This solitary figure, who appeared monthly like a ghost from the high country, conducted his business with quiet efficiency and disappeared again into the wilderness. Doc Henderson had known Jed longer than most, their acquaintance dating back to Dusty's arrival. The veterinarian was a man of Jed's own generation, silver-bearded and gentle-handed, who had seen enough of life to understand that healing sometimes required patience more than medicine. He had been the one to help Jed through Dusty's final days, never charging full price, never pushing when Jed needed time to make difficult decisions. "That dog lived a good life with you," Doc had said on that last day, his hand resting briefly on Jed's shoulder as they stood beside the examination table. "Some animals just know where they belong. Dusty was lucky to find you, but Jed had never felt lucky. If anything, losing Dusty had confirmed his worst fears about the cost of caring. It was easier to trap alone, to read the mountain's moods, in solitude, to build his days around routines that required no one else's approval or presence. The cabin had everything he needed: solar panels for basic electricity, a well that never ran dry, a root cellar stocked with preserved goods, and a workshop where he could repair whatever the mountain weather chose to break. The years had settled into a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. Spring meant checking the winter's damage, repairing what needed fixing, planting his small vegetable garden in the protected spot behind the cabin. Summer brought long days on the trap lines, preparing for the harsh months ahead. Fall was harvest. Time, both from his garden and from the mountain itself, gathering nuts and berries, cutting firewood, making ready for winter's siege. And winter meant the deep quiet, the months when the mountain wore white and the outside world might as well have ceased to exist. It was a life that suited him, or so he told himself on the nights when the silence pressed too close, and he found himself talking to Dusty's grave as if the old dog might answer. He had learned to fill the empty spaces with work, to tire himself so thoroughly each day that sleep came without the dreams that used to wake him, gasping in the dark hours before dawn. The mountain provided everything he needed, and asked nothing in return except respect. It was an honest arrangement, free from the complications that human relationships inevitably brought. No promises to break, no hearts to wound, no futures to mourn when they failed to arrive. Just the daily challenge of survival and the deep satisfaction of meeting it on his own terms. But even the most carefully constructed solitude couldn't completely silence the whispers of memory or the occasional longing for connection that caught him unaware. Sometimes, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and amber, he would remember what it felt like to share such beauty with another living soul. Sometimes, hearing the distant laughter of hikers on the lower trails, he would recall the sound of companionship and wonder if his chosen isolation was wisdom or cowardice. Those moments passed quickly, buried beneath the practical demands of mountain life. There was always wood to split, traps to check, repairs to make. The mountain didn't pause for philosophical reflection, and neither could he if he wanted to survive its harsh embrace. Standing on his porch that morning, coffee cup warming his hands, Jed watched a family of deer pick their way delicately through his meadow. The doe moved with careful grace, her fawn close beside her, both alert to dangers that might emerge from the forest's depths. It was a sight he had witnessed countless times, yet it never failed to remind him of life's fundamental truth. Vulnerability was the price of love, and love was the risk that made life worth living. He pushed the thought away, finished his coffee, and began the day's routine. The traps wouldn't check themselves, and the mountain demanded its daily tribute of attention and respect. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that his carefully ordered world was about to change, that the isolation he had cultivated so carefully was about to be challenged in ways he couldn't imagine. Down in Cedar Falls, in the dusty yard behind Murphy's feed store, a small creature fought against his bonds with the fury of the lost and abandoned. Soon their paths would cross, and the mountain that had sheltered Jed's solitude would become the stage for a different kind of story altogether. The first 3 days with the pup tested every shred of patience Jed had cultivated over his years. Of mountain solitude, the little creature, part shepherd, part mystery, had transformed his peaceful cabin into a battlefield. Nothing was safe from those sharp teeth and desperate claws. On the first morning, Jed woke to find his favorite armchair destroyed, stuffing scattered across the floor like snow after a blizzard. The pup cowered in the corner, hackles raised, growling at the man who had shown him the first kindness he'd known in months. When Jed approached with food, the animal lunged, teeth catching the edge of his flannel shirt and tearing it clean. "Through! Easy there, little fellow," Jed murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. But the pup would have none of it, backing against the wall with wild eyes that held too much fear for such a young creature. By the second day, Jed's hands bore multiple bite marks, and his patience was wearing thin. The pup had chewed through 2 of his leather trapping gloves, destroyed a hand-carved wooden bowl that had taken him weeks to make, and somehow managed to knock over his entire spice rack while Jed was outside checking the water pump. Each attempt at gentle approach was met with snarls and snapping teeth. It was on the 3rd morning that everything changed. Jed had been trying to examine the pup more closely, concerned about a slight limp he'd noticed. As he knelt beside the animal's makeshift bed, speaking in the soft tones he'd once used with Dusty, the pup's struggling grew frantic. In his desperation to escape, the animal twisted violently, and Jed saw something that made his blood run cold. Across the pup's ribs, barely visible beneath the thick fur, ran a series of old scars, thin, deliberate lines that could only have come from a knife or razor. Someone had hurt this creature systematically, repeatedly. The discovery hit Jed like a physical blow, memories rushing back with devastating clarity. He stumbled backward, his hands shaking as images flooded his mind, images he had spent 10 years trying to forget. A hospital room, white sheets, the steady beep of machines, his son's small hand so still in his own. "No," he whispered, pressing the heels of his palms against his eyes. "Not now." But the memories came anyway, relentless as a mountain avalanche. His wife Sarah's voice, breaking as she told him about the accident, how she'd only looked away for a moment, how fast it had happened, the way their 5-year-old boy had looked up at him from that hospital bed, trying to be brave even as the life slowly left his eyes. The guilt came with the memories, sharp and familiar. If he'd been home instead of working late again, if he'd insisted on driving them himself, if he'd been a better father, a better husband, a better man. The endless chain of if-onlys that had driven him from his old life and into the mountains, seeking a place where his failures couldn't follow. When the flashback finally released its grip, Jed found himself sitting on his cabin floor, breathing hard. The pup watched him from across the room, no longer growling. Something in the animal's posture had changed, as if he recognized a kindred suffering. Slowly, carefully, Jed reached for the old Bible that sat on his shelf, Sarah's Bible, carried up the mountain in those first dark days after he'd buried his family and fled civilization. As he lifted it, a photograph slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. The image was faded but clear. Jed and Sarah on their front porch, their son Danny perched on his father's shoulders, all 3 of them laughing at something beyond the camera's view. It had been taken just 2 weeks before the accident, back when Jed still believed that love was a blessing rather than a curse, when he'd thought his future was measured in decades of happiness rather than moments of joy snatched between sorrows. He stared at the photograph, remembering how it felt to be that man, younger, happier, convinced that he could protect the people he loved simply by loving them enough. How naive he'd been. How utterly unprepared for the way life could shatter everything beautiful in the space of a heartbeat. The pup crept closer, drawn perhaps by the scent of old grief. This time, when Jed looked up, he saw something different in those dark eyes. Not just fear, but recognition. This animal understood abandonment, understood what it meant to be thrown away by the very people who should have offered protection. "You've been hurt too, haven't you?" Jed said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Somebody you trusted did. Terrible things to you." The pup didn't retreat when Jed slowly extended his hand. Instead, he sniffed cautiously, his body tense but no longer aggressive. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, the little creature allowed human touch without responding with teeth or claws. Martha's voice echoed from outside, calling his name as her truck crunched up the gravel drive. She'd been coming by, more frequently lately, worried about his increasing isolation. Through the window, Jed could see her approaching the porch with her usual determined stride, a casserole dish balanced in her hands. "Jed? You decent! I brought you some of that cornbread you used to like." He quickly tucked the photograph back into the Bible, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Coming, Martha." When he opened the door, Martha took one look at his face, and her expression shifted from cheerful concern to something deeper. "Lord Almighty, Jed, you look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," he said, but Martha had known him too long to be fooled by such simple deflections. Her gaze moved past him to the pup, who had emerged from his corner to investigate the new arrival. "Well, I'll be. So the stories are true. You really did take that wild little thing from town?" "He needed a home," Jed said simply. Martha studied both man and animal with the sharp eye of someone who had spent decades reading between the lines of human behavior. "Looks to me like you both need something," she said quietly. "Question is whether you're brave enough to let yourselves have it." After she left, Jed sat on his porch steps, the pup curled warily nearby. The spring evening was settling over the mountain, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the distance, he could hear the creek bubbling over the rocks, the same sound that had lulled him to sleep for 10 years of self-imposed exile. The decision crystallized in that moment, clear and undeniable as mountain air. He could take the pup back to town, hand him over to someone else, return to his carefully ordered solitude. Or he could choose the harder path, the one that led through old pain toward something that might, with time and patience, become healing. He thought of Sarah, of Danny, of the family he'd lost and the guilt he'd carried ever since. He thought of Dusty, loyal and loving until the very end. And he thought of the scarred little creature beside him, who had every reason to hate the world, but was still capable of trust. "What do you say, boy?" he murmured, reaching out to scratch behind the pup's ears, ready to learn how to be a family. "Again?" The pup leaned into his touch, and for the first time in 10 years, Jedediah Cain began to believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for second chances. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Trust, Jed learned, was like mountain granite, formed under pressure over long periods and just as easily shattered if handled carelessly. But something fundamental had shifted in those moments on the porch, and both man and animal seemed to sense it. Jed started small. Instead of approaching the pup directly, he would sit nearby and talk, sharing the thoughts that had rattled around his head in solitude for so many years. He told the pup about the mountain, about the changing seasons, about the deer family that visited each morning. He spoke of Dusty, of the walks they'd taken and the quiet companionship they'd shared. "That old dog never asked for much," Jed said one evening as they sat by the fire. The pup had claimed a spot near the hearth, close enough for warmth, but far enough to bolt if needed. Just wanted to be useful, wanted to belong somewhere. Reckon that's not too much to ask for. The pup's ears would prick forward when Jed spoke, those dark eyes following every movement. There was intelligence there, sharp and watchful, along with something that might have been hope if it hadn't been tempered by so much wariness. Food became their first bridge. Jed discovered that the pup would eat more readily if he sat nearby, not watching directly but maintaining a presence that said safety rather than threat. He began preparing simple meals for both of them, talking through the process as if the pup were his sous chef. "Mountain living teaches you to appreciate the basics," he said, browning venison in his cast-iron skillet. "Good meat, clean water, And something to share it with. Used to cook for 3, then it was 2, then just me. Nice to have someone to feed again, even if you're not much for conversation yet. The pup had begun to respond to his name. Bear, which seemed to fit his. Dark fur and compact, sturdy build. It wasn't the name Jed had planned to give him, but it emerged naturally during one of their evening talks, and the pup's head had tilted in a way that suggested recognition, even approval. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Jed made his first major mistake. Bear had been making steady progress, allowing brief touches during feeding time and following Jed around the cabin at a respectful distance. Feeling confident, Jed decided it was time for a proper examination of those old scars. He approached slowly, speaking in the gentle tones that had been working so well. Bear watched him come, tail wagging hesitantly, but when Jed's hands moved toward his ribs, toward those hidden marks of old cruelty, the pup exploded into panic. The attack was swift and desperate. Bear's teeth found Jed's forearm, sinking deep, enough to draw blood before the man could pull away. But it wasn't the bite that hurt most. It was the look in Bear's eyes afterward, the way he retreated to the farthest corner of the cabin and curled into a tight ball, shaking with terror and shame. "It's all right," Jed said, wrapping his bleeding arm in a dish towel. "It's all right, boy. I pushed too hard, too fast. That's on me, not you." But Bear wouldn't come near him for 2 days. Meals had to be left across the room. The careful progress they'd made seemed to evaporate like morning mist. Jed found himself wondering if he'd been foolish to think this could work, if some damage ran too deep for healing. On the 3rd day, as Jed sat reading by lamplight, Bear crept across the cabin floor and gently laid his head on Jed's boot. The gesture was so tentative, so full of apology and hope, that Jed had to blink back tears. "We're both learning," he whispered, carefully reaching down to stroke the pup's ears. "Both figuring out how to trust again. Guess that makes us even." The incident taught them both valuable lessons about boundaries and patience. Jed learned to read Bear's signals better, to recognize when the pup was feeling overwhelmed or triggered by memories neither of them could fully understand. Bear, in turn, seemed to grasp that Jed's intentions were kind, even when his methods were clumsy. They developed new routines, morning walks that started short and gradually lengthened as Bear's confidence grew. Evening sessions where Jed would work on small repairs while Bear supervised from his chosen spot by the fire. Meal preparation that involved Bear as observer and occasional taste tester when Jed dropped bits of food accidentally within reach. The breakthrough came during a thunderstorm that rolled through the valley with unusual ferocity. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines, and thunder shook the cabin's foundations. Jed had weathered countless such storms in his mountain retreat, but Bear had never experienced one from the safety of a warm, dry shelter. The first crack of thunder sent the pup scrambling under Jed's kitchen table, whimpering in terror. Rain lashed against the windows with increasing intensity, and each flash of lightning seemed to send Bear deeper into panic. Without thinking, Jed got down on his hands and knees and crawled under the table beside him. "It's just noise," he said softly. "Big noise, but just noise. Nothing that can hurt you in here." For the next 2 hours, they rode out the storm together in that unlikely shelter. Jed talked quietly about other storms he'd weathered, about the beauty that came after the violence, about how even the mountain needed the cleansing that only wild weather could bring. Gradually, Bear's trembling subsided, and by the time the thunder had rumbled away into the distance, the pup was sleeping with his head pillowed on Jed's leg. When Martha arrived for her weekly check-in the following afternoon, she found them working together in the garden. Jed was pulling weeds while Bear supervised from the shade of the vegetable patch, occasionally investigating interesting scents or chasing butterflies that ventured too close. "Well, would you look at that?" Martha said, leaning against her truck, and watching them with obvious satisfaction. "Boys filling out nicely, getting some meat on those bones. Good mountain air and regular meals," Jed replied, but they both knew it was more than that. Bear was beginning to look like what he was meant to be, Not a victim cowering from the world, but a young dog, discovering the simple pleasures of safety and belonging. "And how are you doing?" Martha asked with the directness that had always characterized their friendship. "Really doing, I mean." Jed considered the question as he watched Bear nose around the tomato plants. 3 weeks ago, he would have given her the standard response: fine, managing, getting by. But something about sharing his space with another living creature had awakened parts of himself he'd thought were permanently buried. "Learning," he said finally. "Learning that maybe I'm not as broken as I thought. Or maybe I am, but that doesn't mean I can't still be useful to somebody who needs me." Martha nodded, understanding passing between them without need for further explanation. Some lessons she knew couldn't be rushed. Some healing took its own time, following rhythms as old and patient as the mountains themselves. As she drove away, Jed watched Bear chase a leaf across the yard, tail wagging with the first real joy he'd shown since arriving. Progress was slow, measured in small moments rather than grand gestures. But it was real, solid as the granite peaks that surrounded them, and that was enough. Spring had settled fully into the mountain valley by the time Bear's second month at the cabin arrived. The aspen trees wore fresh green leaves that shimmered like coins in the morning light, and the wildflower meadows bloomed in riots of purple lupine and bright yellow paintbrush. It was the kind of season that made a man grateful to be alive, and Jed found himself experiencing moments of something that felt dangerously close to contentment. Bear had grown visibly during his weeks of steady meals and mountain air. His coat had thickened and gained a healthy shine, and the sharp angles of his ribs had softened under layers of proper nutrition. More importantly, his eyes had lost some of their hunted wariness, replaced by the natural curiosity of a young dog discovering his world. The morning routine had evolved into something both man and dog looked forward to. Jed would wake to find Bear waiting patiently by the door, no longer cowering in corners, but ready for their daily patrol of the property. They would walk the perimeter together, Jed checking his snares and traps, while Bear investigated scents and sounds with increasing confidence. It was during one of these walks that they encountered their first real test of Bear's progress. As they rounded the bend near the creek, they came face to face with a black bear sow and her 2 cubs, all 3 animals drinking from the clear mountain water. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. The sow raised her massive head, water dripping from her muzzle, as she evaluated this potential threat to her offspring. Her cubs, sensing their mother's tension, moved closer to her protective bulk. For a heartbeat, violence seemed inevitable. Bear froze beside Jed's leg, every muscle rigid with fear. But instead of bolting or attacking, he looked up at his human companion, seeking guidance. It was a moment of profound trust, the first time the dog had turned to Jed for leadership rather than relying solely on his own survival instincts. "Easy, boy," Jed whispered, his hand finding Bear's head. "We're going to back away slow and give the lady her space. No sudden moves." They retreated carefully, Jed keeping his movements deliberate and calm, while Bear stayed pressed against his leg. Only when they were well clear of the creek did both of them release the breath they'd been holding. "That's how you handle mountain neighbors," Jed told Bear as they walked back toward the cabin. "Respect their space, don't make any challenges, and everybody goes home safe. She's got babies to protect, just like any good mother would." The mention of mothers brought an unexpected tightness to Jed's throat. He thought of Sarah, of how fierce she'd been in protecting Danny, how she'd worried over every scraped knee and childhood fever. The memory should have brought the familiar stab of loss, but somehow, with Bear trotting beside him in the morning sunshine, it felt more like gratitude for having known such love, even briefly. That afternoon brought visitors of the human variety. Doc Henderson's truck coughed its way up the mountain road, followed by a smaller vehicle that Jed didn't recognize. As the vehicles parked near his cabin, he saw Doc emerge from the driver's seat alongside a woman in her 30s with auburn hair and practical clothes. "Afternoon, Jed," Doc called out with his customary gentle smile. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. This is Dr. Sarah Winters. She's the new veterinarian setting up practice in Cedar Falls. Thought she might take a look at your new companion if you're willing." The woman stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to working with wary animals and their equally wary owners. "I've heard about Bear from half the town," she said, extending a hand to Jed. "Martha Hutchins speaks very highly of both of you." Jed shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the way her eyes immediately sought out Bear, who had retreated to the cabin's porch but hadn't fled entirely. "He's come a long way, but he's still skittish around strangers. The best ones, usually." Dr. Winters replied. "Mind if I try something? I'll keep my distance. Let him decide how close is comfortable." What followed was a masterclass in patience. Dr. Winters settled herself on the ground several yards from the porch, not looking directly at Bear, but speaking in low, conversational tones about the weather, the mountain scenery, anything that might normalize her presence. She pulled treats from her pocket and tossed them gently in Bear's direction, never forcing interaction, but making it clear that good things might come from her proximity. After 20 minutes, Bear had crept close, enough to accept treats directly from her outstretched hand. Another 10 minutes, and she was able to run gentle fingers along his neck and shoulders, checking for swollen glands and feeling for any obvious injuries. "He's in remarkably good shape considering his history," she reported to Jed. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. His coat is healthy, he's gained good weight, and his muscles have good tone. I can see some of those old scars you mentioned, but they're well healed. Physically, he's thriving." "And mentally?" Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "That'll take longer," Dr. Winters said honestly. "Trauma runs deep. In animals just like it does in people. But he's bonded with you, and that's the foundation everything else builds on. Trust is the first medicine, and you've already given him that." After the veterinarians left, Jed and Bear settled into their evening routine, but something felt different, charged with possibility. Watching Dr. Winters work with Bear had shown Jed just how far they'd both come. The dog, who had arrived as a snarling, terrified creature, was beginning to reveal glimpses of who he might become. Loyal, intelligent, brave in his own quiet way. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jed found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't for years. Not the distant future with its inevitable sorrows, but the immediate tomorrow, the next week, the changing seasons that he and Bear would navigate together. "What do you think, boy?" he asked as Bear settled beside his chair on the porch. "Ready to see what comes next?" Bear's tail thumped against the wooden decking, and for the first time since arriving on the mountain, the sound seemed less like an ending and more like a beginning. The evening air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, the promise of summer, warmth, and something else that Jed was just beginning to recognize: hope. In the distance, an owl called to its mate, the sound echoing across the valley. Somewhere out there, other creatures were finding their way home to safety and companionship. It seemed only fitting that a scarred man and a wounded dog might do the same. Summer arrived in the high country with the kind of glory that made a man understand why poets spent lifetimes trying to capture mountains in words. The days stretched long and golden, filled with the songs of meadowlarks and the whisper of wind through pine needles. For the first time in a decade, Jed found himself truly noticing the beauty around him, seeing it through Bear's wondering eyes as much as his own. Bear had transformed into something magnificent, no longer the cowering, aggressive creature from those first desperate weeks. He moved through the mountain world with growing confidence and grace. His coat had darkened to a rich chocolate brown with hints of gold at the tips, and his frame had filled out into the powerful build of a young working dog. More importantly, his spirit had begun to unfold like a flower finding sunlight after too long in shadow. Their days had taken on a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Morning walks that now extended for miles along game trails and old logging roads. Afternoons spent working around the property, with Bear serving as both supervisor and eager assistant. Evenings on the porch, where Jed would read aloud from whatever book had caught his fancy, while Bear dozed contentedly at his feet. It was during one of these extended walks that they discovered Bear's gift. They had been following an old deer trail up the eastern slope, the path winding through stands of lodgepole pine and across meadows carpeted with Indian paintbrush. Jed was enjoying the exercise and the company, thinking about nothing more pressing than whether the weather would hold for the rest of the week. Bear suddenly stopped, his entire body going rigid with attention. His nose worked the air, and a low whine escaped his throat, not the fearful sound of his early days, but something else entirely, something urgent. "What is it, boy?" Jed asked, following Bear's intense gaze toward a section of forest that looked no different from any other. Bear began moving toward the trees with purpose, his movements careful but determined. Jed followed, trusting the dog's instincts, even though he couldn't sense whatever had captured Bear's attention. They pushed through a thicket of serviceberry bushes and emerged into a small clearing where Bear's discovery became clear. An elderly hiker sat propped against a fallen log, his face pale and his breathing labored. His ankle was clearly broken, swollen to twice its normal size, and his pack lay scattered where he'd fallen. The man looked up at their approach with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Thank God," he whispered. "I've been here since yesterday. Thought I was going to die up here." His name was Harold Morrison, and he'd been day hiking alone when he'd taken a wrong turn and missed the main trail. The fall that broke his ankle had happened just as afternoon thunderclouds had rolled in, forcing him to seek what shelter he could find. He'd spent a cold, frightening night in the wilderness, growing weaker by the hour. "Bear found you," Jed said simply, kneeling beside the injured man to assess his condition. "He's got a nose for trouble, seems like." Bear sat quietly nearby, watchful and alert, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. There was something profound in his posture, a sense of purpose that went beyond simple training or instinct. This dog, who had once been written off as vicious and untrainable, had just saved a man's life. Getting Harold down the mountain safely required all of Jed's wilderness skills and more improvisation than he'd used in years. He fashioned a crude stretcher from branches and his spare jacket, then began the slow, careful journey back toward the cabin where he could call for emergency help. Bear proved invaluable during the rescue. He seemed to understand that his job was to scout ahead, finding the safest routes and alerting Jed to obstacles. When Harold grew faint from pain and dehydration, Bear would position himself where the injured man could see him, providing a calming presence that somehow made the ordeal more bearable. The helicopter evacuation team that finally arrived at Jed's cabin treated Bear like a hero, which he accepted with the dignified modesty of a dog who was simply doing what came naturally. Harold Morrison, conscious now thanks to IV fluids and pain medication, made a point of thanking both his rescuers before being loaded into the helicopter. "That dog has a gift," one of the paramedics told Jed as they prepared for takeoff. "Ever think about training him for search and rescue? The Forest Service is always looking for good dogs, and this one's got the instincts for it." After the helicopter disappeared over the ridge, Jed and Bear walked back to their cabin in contemplative silence. Something had shifted during the rescue, something that went beyond the satisfaction of helping a fellow human being. Bear had revealed a side of himself that suggested depths Jed was only beginning to understand. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold, Jed found himself thinking about purpose. For 10 years, he'd lived without any goal beyond survival, beyond avoiding the pain that came with caring too much. But watching Bear work that day, seeing the intelligence and dedication in the dog's actions, had awakened something in Jed that he'd thought was permanently buried. "You've got something special, don't you?" he said, scratching behind Bear's ears. "More than just being a good companion, you've got work to do in this world." Bear's tail thumped against the porch boards, and his dark eyes seemed to hold understanding. This dog, who had started as a victim, was becoming something else entirely. A helper, a guardian, a bridge between the isolated world Jed had built and the larger community that still needed what they both had to offer. 3 days later, Dr. Winters arrived with news that changed everything. She'd been talking to contacts in the State Forest Service about Bear's rescue of Harold Morrison, and word had spread quickly through the tight-knit community of search and rescue professionals. "They want to meet him," she told Jed, as they watched Bear demonstrate his newfound confidence by approaching her truck without hesitation. "There's a training program starting next month for wilderness search dogs. Not all dogs have the temperament for it, but Bear has something they need," Jed finished, understanding where this was leading. "He does. But it would mean leaving the mountains sometimes, working with other people, other dogs. I know how private you are, and I wouldn't blame you if—" "When do we start?" Jed interrupted, the words surprising him as much as they did Dr. Winters. Because that's what this was really about, wasn't it? Not just Bear's training, but both of them stepping back into a world they'd left behind. Bear had shown him that healing wasn't just about learning to live with wounds. Sometimes it was about discovering that those wounds could be transformed into gifts for others who needed them. The search and rescue training facility sat in a valley 30 miles north of Cedar Falls, a collection of weathered buildings surrounded by the kind of terrain that tested both human and canine limits. Rocky outcroppings, dense forest, steep ravines and open meadows provided endless opportunities for the kind of realistic training that could mean the difference between life and death in actual rescue situations. Jed felt his chest tighten as they approached the facility in his old Ford pickup, Bear sitting alert in the passenger seat, nose pressed to the window. It had been nearly 15 years since Jed had worked closely with a team of any kind, and the prospect of integrating into this tight-knit community of rescue professionals brought back memories he'd spent a decade trying to forget. The team leader was a woman named Captain Rosa Martinez, a compact, no-nonsense former military officer whose handshake could have cracked walnuts. She'd run search and rescue operations throughout the western states for 20 years, and her reputation for finding lost souls in impossible terrain was legendary. "So you're the hermit with the miracle dog," she said, sizing up both Jed and Bear with eyes that missed nothing. "Heard about the Morrison rescue. Impressive work for an untrained animal." "Bear's got good instincts," Jed replied, uncomfortable with the attention but determined to see this through. "We're here to learn how to use them properly." The training program was more intense than either of them had expected. Days began before sunrise with conditioning runs that pushed both dogs and handlers to their physical limits. Bear adapted quickly to the routine, his mountain-hardened muscles serving him well as he learned to navigate obstacle courses and practice the complex scent-tracking exercises that formed the foundation of search and rescue work. Jed struggled more with the social aspects of the training. Working alongside other handlers meant constant interaction, shared meals, and the kind of casual camaraderie he'd actively avoided for years. The other team members were good people, dedicated, professionals who'd chosen this demanding work out of genuine desire to help others, but their easy familiarity with each other only highlighted Jed's isolation. It was Bear who bridged that gap, as he seemed to bridge everything else in Jed's slowly expanding world. The other dogs accepted him immediately, recognizing something in his steady demeanor that spoke of reliability and competence. More importantly, Bear's obvious attachment to Jed served as a kind of character reference that no amount of words could have provided. "That dog trusts you completely," observed Tom Bradley, a veteran handler whose German Shepherd had been working rescues for 6 years. "Dogs don't give that kind of loyalty to just anyone. Takes a special kind of person to earn that from an animal that's been hurt like yours has." The breakthrough came during their 3rd week of training, during a complex scenario that simulated searching for survivors of a plane crash in rough terrain. The exercise area covered several square miles of forest and rocky ground, with volunteer victims hidden in locations that tested every skill the teams had learned. Bear and Jed were assigned a sector that included a steep ravine filled with deadfall and loose rock. Other teams had searched similar areas without success, and the exercise was entering its second day when Bear suddenly went rigid with concentration, his nose working the air with the intense focus that Jed had learned to recognize and trust. "He's got something," Jed called out to Captain Martinez, who was coordinating the search from a central command post. Bear began picking his way carefully down the ravine, following a scent trail that was invisible to human senses but clear as a highway to his sensitive nose. Jed followed, trusting the dog's instincts even when the terrain seemed impassable. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, Bear led them to a cave opening hidden behind a tangle of fallen trees. Inside, they found two of the volunteer victims, a man and woman who had been positioned in what was supposed to be one of the most challenging hiding spots in the entire exercise area. Other teams had passed within 50 yards of the cave without detecting any sign of the people inside. "Incredible," Captain Martinez said later as she reviewed the exercise results. That scent had been cold for over 24 hours, and the wind patterns in that ravine should have dispersed it completely. "Your dog didn't just find them. He solved a puzzle that shouldn't have been solvable, but the real test came that evening, during the informal gathering that marked the end of each training week. These sessions were as much about team building as celebration, and Jed had been dreading them since the program began. He'd managed to avoid most social interactions by pleading exhaustion or using Bear's training needs as an excuse, but Captain Martinez had made it clear that this particular gathering was mandatory. The stories began as they always did, with handlers sharing accounts of memorable rescues, close calls, and the peculiar satisfactions of their demanding work. Jed listened from the edge of the group, Bear pressed against his leg like a furry anchor, keeping him from drifting away entirely. "What about you, Jed?" asked Sarah Chen, whose border collie had been working avalanche rescues for 4 years. "You've got the look of someone with stories to tell." The question hung in the air like smoke from the campfire, and Jed felt the familiar urge to deflect, to retreat behind the walls he'd built so carefully over the years. But something in the faces around him, genuine interest rather than idle curiosity, made him pause. "I used to be a different person," he said finally, his voice rough with disuse in this kind of setting. "Lost some people I loved. Lost my way for a while. Been living alone on the mountain for 10 years. Figured that was how it would always be." He paused, looking down at Bear, who seemed to understand the gravity of the moment and leaned more heavily against his leg. "Then this dog showed up in my life, and everything started changing. Turns out maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. Maybe neither of us was." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of respectful quiet that acknowledged shared understanding of loss and recovery. These people knew about finding hope in dark places, about the long road back from trauma. "The mountain taught me a lot about survival," Jed continued. "But Bear's teaching me about living. Seems like maybe it's time I learned the difference." Captain Martinez nodded slowly, and Jed could see something shift in her assessment of him. "Welcome to the team," she said simply, and somehow those 4 words carried the weight of acceptance that Jed hadn't realized he'd been seeking. Walking back to their quarters that night, Bear trotting contentedly beside him, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than his own carefully guarded solitude. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that sometimes the only way forward was to take the leap. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late August, just as the mountain valleys were beginning to show the first hints of autumn gold. Jed and Bear had completed their certification the week before, officially joining the regional search and rescue team after passing every test with distinction. They were settling into their new routine when the radio crackled to life in Jed's cabin. All available units, we have a missing child situation. Captain Martinez's voice cut through the morning calm. 8-year-old boy, missing since yesterday evening. Location is Blackwood Canyon, approximately 15 miles northeast of Cedar Falls. This is a priority 1 response. Jed felt his blood turn to ice water. Missing child, 8 years old. The same age Danny would have been when he forced the thought away, focusing on the immediate need. But his hands shook as he gathered his gear, and Bear seemed to sense his sudden tension, pressing close with concerned whines. The drive to Blackwood Canyon passed in a blur of mountain roads and barely controlled panic. Jed found himself reliving fragments of that terrible day 15 years ago. The phone call from the hospital, the mad rush through city traffic that had ended in a sterile waiting room where hope went to die. He pulled over twice to steady his breathing. Bear's steady presence, the only thing keeping him from turning around and fleeing back to the safety of his mountain retreat. The search command post was organized chaos when they arrived. Local sheriffs, deputies coordinated with Forest Service personnel, while volunteer search teams assembled their gear. Parents and family members clustered near the information tent, their faces etched with the particular terror that comes with a missing child. That's when Jed saw him. The man stood apart from the crowd, his back turned as he spoke urgently into a cell phone. But something about his posture, the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head, struck Jed like a physical blow. When the man turned, ending his call with obvious frustration, Jed's world tilted on its axis. Marcus Brennan, 15 years older, gray threading through his dark hair, lines of worry etched deep around his eyes. But unmistakably, the same man who had been driving the car that rainy night in Denver. The man whose moment of inattention, whose glance at his phone while driving, had sent Jed's family spinning into oncoming traffic. For a heartbeat, the two men stared at each other across the crowded staging area. Recognition dawned in Marcus's eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like shame, mixed with desperate hope. "Jed?" Marcus's voice cracked. "Jesus, Jed, is that really you?" The years collapsed between them, and suddenly, Jed was back, in that courtroom, listening to Marcus's tearful testimony about the text message that had distracted him for just a split second. The apology that had meant nothing in the face of such devastating loss. The plea for forgiveness that Jed had been unable to give. "Your boy," Jed managed to ask, though the words felt like ground glass in his throat. Marcus nodded, his composure cracking. "Tommy, he's 8. We were camping, and he wandered off from our campsite yesterday evening. We've been searching all night, but—" His voice broke entirely. Bear whined softly, sensing the emotional storm raging around him. The dog moved between the two men, his presence somehow both barrier and bridge, giving them space while keeping them connected. "I know what you're thinking," Marcus said quietly, "that this is some kind of cosmic justice, that I deserve this because of what I did to your family." Jed wanted to agree. For 15 years, he'd carried the weight of his hatred for this man, the anger that had driven him from civilization and into the mountains. Part of him wanted to walk away, to let Marcus face this nightmare alone, as punishment for the nightmare he'd caused. But looking at Marcus's face, seeing the same raw terror that he himself had experienced that horrible night, Jed felt something shift inside him. This wasn't justice, it was just another tragedy in a world that already held too many of them. "Where was he last seen?" Jed asked, pulling out his search map. Relief flooded Marcus's features, followed immediately by gratitude so profound it was painful to witness. "The Cascade Creek Campground, Site 47. He was playing by the creek while we set up camp, and when my wife called him for dinner, he was gone," Jed finished. He'd heard variations of this story dozens of times. During training, children were drawn to water, to the adventure of exploration, to the kind of innocent curiosity that could lead them far from safety before they realized they were lost. Captain Martinez approached them, her expression grim. Jed, I need your team on the North Ridge section. It's rough terrain, but if the boy wandered that direction—" "He didn't," interrupted Marcus. "Tommy's afraid of heights, always has been. If anything, he'd follow the creek downstream, stay in the low areas where he feels safe." Jed studied the topographical map, his trained eye noting the creek's meandering path through increasingly dense forest. Other teams were already working the obvious routes, but there was a section about 2 miles downstream where the creek bent sharply around a rocky outcropping. It was the kind of place a scared child might seek shelter, but far enough from the campground that most searches wouldn't extend that far initially. "Bear and I will take the downstream section," Jed told Captain Martinez. "Past the bend, where it gets thick. That's outside our initial search grid," she warned. "If you don't find sign by noon, we'll need you back here for the main sweep." Jed nodded, but he was already moving toward his truck, Bear padding beside him with the alert focus that meant work was about to begin. As they reached the vehicle, Marcus caught up with them. "Let me come with you," he pleaded. "I know I don't have the right to ask, but he's my son, and You'll slow us down," Jed said bluntly. "This is technical terrain, and we need to move fast." Marcus's face crumpled, but before he could respond, Jed continued. "But you can help from here. Get us a piece of Tommy's clothing, something with his scent, and stay by the radio. If we find anything, you'll be the first to know." The drive to the downstream search area passed in tense silence, broken only by the crackle of radio traffic as other teams reported their progress. Bear sat alert in the passenger seat, seeming to understand that this search was different, that the stakes were higher than any training exercise could simulate. As they reached the creek access point and began gearing up, Jed found himself thinking about the strange twists that life could take. 15 years ago, Marcus Brennan had destroyed his world in a moment of carelessness. Now, faced with his own family crisis, he had turned to the very man he'd wronged for help. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that Jed found himself genuinely wanting to find Tommy Brennan, not for Marcus's sake, but because somewhere in the wilderness was a frightened 8-year-old boy who needed to go home to the people who loved him. "Ready, Bear?" he asked, clipping the search harness onto the dog's powerful frame. Bear's tail wagged once, sharp and purposeful. "Ready." They plunged into the forest, following the creek's winding path into terrain that grew wilder with each step. Behind them, the sounds of the search operation faded into the distance. Ahead lay the kind of wilderness that could swallow a small boy without trace, or if they were lucky, shelter him until help could arrive. The irony wasn't lost on Jed, that he was about to risk everything to save the child of the man who had taken his own child away. But as they moved deeper into the forest, Bear's nose working the complex scents that human senses couldn't detect, Jed realized that this wasn't about irony or justice or even forgiveness. This was about a lost boy who needed to be found, and 2 broken souls who had learned to make their wounds into something useful. Everything else could wait until the child was safe. The forest along Cascade Creek had the kind of dense, primordial feel that made civilization seem like a distant memory. Ancient cedars towered overhead, their massive trunks creating a cathedral of green shadow, broken only by shafts of golden sunlight. The undergrowth grew thick here, fed by the creek's moisture and protected from the wind by the surrounding ridges. Bear worked methodically along the creek bank, his nose reading the story, written in scent molecules invisible to human perception. Jed followed, his trained eye scanning for the subtle signs that might indicate a child's passage. Disturbed vegetation, fabric caught on thorns, footprints in the soft earth near the water's edge. They had been searching for 2 hours when Bear's behavior changed. The dog's pace quickened, his movements becoming more focused and urgent. His nose worked the air with the intensity that Jed had learned to recognize as a positive trail indication. "What is it, boy?" Jed whispered, though he already knew. Bear had caught something. The trail led them away from the creek, up a steep, embankment thick with serviceberry bushes and mountain ash. Bear moved with careful purpose, pausing occasionally to confirm the scent before pressing forward. Jed's radio crackled periodically with updates from other search teams, all reporting negative results, but he kept his own progress to himself for now. False hope was crueler than no hope at all. The terrain grew increasingly challenging as they climbed. Rocky outcroppings forced them to detour around obstacles, and the forest canopy blocked out most of the sky, creating a green twilight that made navigation difficult. More than once, Jed found himself grateful for the GPS unit clipped to his vest, the only thing keeping them oriented in the maze of ridges and valleys. Bear suddenly stopped, his entire body rigid with attention. A low whine escaped his throat, not the sound of excitement that usually accompanied a find, but something else, something that made the hair on Jed's neck stand up. "Easy, Bear," Jed murmured, moving up beside the dog. "What do you see?" The answer became clear as they crested a small rise. Below them lay a natural depression in the forest floor, perhaps 50 yards across, where some ancient geological event had created a bowl-shaped clearing. And there, huddled against the base of a massive fallen log, was a small figure in a red jacket. Tommy Brennan. Jed's first instinct was relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. The boy was alive, conscious, and apparently uninjured, but as they approached more closely, Jed realized why Bear had sounded that note of concern. Tommy wasn't alone. A large black bear, probably a sow given the protective posture, sat approximately 20 feet from the boy. She wasn't aggressive. If anything, her demeanor seemed almost maternal, but she was clearly aware of the child's presence and had positioned herself between Tommy and any potential threat, including Jed and Bear. The situation was delicate, beyond anything Jed had encountered in training. Wild animals could be unpredictable under the best circumstances, and a bear protecting what she perceived as a vulnerable creature could become dangerous very quickly. Yet Tommy appeared unharmed, suggesting that the bear had been guarding rather than threatening him. Jed pulled out his radio, speaking in the lowest possible whisper. "This is Team 7 to command. I have visual on the subject. He appears uninjured, but there's a complication. I need wildlife protocol and possibly a ranger with tranquilizer capability. Do not approach with large teams. Repeat, do not approach with large teams." Captain Martinez's voice came back immediately, crisp with professional concern. "Copy Team 7. What's the nature of the complication?" "Adult black bear. Female, approximately 20 feet from the subject. Bear appears to be exhibiting protective behavior. Subject shows no signs of distress, but the situation is delicate." There was a pause before Martinez responded. "Team 7, are you qualified to handle wildlife intervention?" Jed looked at Bear, who sat quietly beside him, watching the scene below with intelligent eyes. The dog showed no signs of aggression or fear, simply alert observation. After years in the mountains, both of them had learned to read animal behavior, to understand the difference between threat and territorial display. "Affirmative, Command, but I need time to assess the situation properly." "Copy. Wildlife team is en route, but they're 40 minutes out. Use your best judgment, but do not take unnecessary risks." Jed clipped the radio back to his vest and settled into observation mode. The key to handling wildlife encounters was patience, understanding the animal's motivations before attempting any intervention. He pulled out his binoculars and studied the scene more carefully. Tommy appeared to be sleeping, exhausted from his night in the wilderness. The bear sat like a patient sentinel, occasionally lifting her head to scan for threats but showing no signs of agitation. Most tellingly, she hadn't reacted aggressively to Jed and Bear's presence, suggesting that she wasn't in a highly defensive state. As Jed watched, something extraordinary happened. Tommy stirred, opening his eyes and sitting up slowly. When he saw the bear instead of panic, his face showed only sleepy recognition. He spoke to the animal in the kind of matter-of-fact tone that only children could manage. "Morning, Mama Bear. Are you still keeping watch?" The bear's ears twitched forward, and she made a soft huffing sound that seemed almost conversational. Tommy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out what looked like a granola bar, carefully breaking off a piece and tossing it toward the bear before eating the rest himself. Jed realized he was witnessing something remarkable. Somehow, this 8-year-old boy had managed to establish a peaceful relationship with a wild black bear. Whether through pure innocence or some intuitive understanding of animal behavior, Tommy had convinced the bear that he was worthy of protection rather than predation. "Well, I'll be damned," Jed whispered to Bear. "Kids got more wood sense than most adults." But the situation remained precarious. The bear's protective instincts meant that any approach would be interpreted as a potential threat to Tommy. And while the animal seemed calm now, that could change in an instant if she felt the boy was in danger. Jed's radio crackled again, and he heard Marcus Brennan's voice, tight with worry. "Command, this is Tommy's father. What's the status? Is he okay?" Before Captain Martinez could respond, Jed keyed his radio. "Mr. Brennan, this is Team 7. Your son is safe and appears uninjured. However, we have a delicate situation that requires careful handling. I need you to trust me and let me work. Just bring him home." Marcus's voice broke. "Please just bring my boy home." The raw emotion in those words hit Jed harder than he'd expected. For a moment, he was back in that hospital corridor, feeling the same desperate need to protect, to fix, to somehow undo the terrible thing that had happened. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. He was now experiencing the same protective instincts for Marcus's child that Marcus must have felt for his own family 15 years ago. Bear nudged Jed's hand with his nose, bringing him back to the present. The dog's dark eyes seemed to hold understanding, as if he knew the internal struggle his partner was facing. This wasn't about the past anymore. It was about a frightened child who needed to go home. Jed made his decision. "Command, this is Team 7. I'm going to attempt a gradual approach. The subject appears to have established rapport with the wildlife, which may work in our favor. I'll maintain radio contact. Negative, Team 7. Wait for the wildlife team. With respect, Command, 40 minutes is too long. The weather forecast shows storms moving in this afternoon, and we need to get the boy out before conditions deteriorate." There was a long pause before Martinez responded. "Proceed with extreme caution, Team 7. You have tactical control of the situation." Jed looked down at the clearing where Tommy sat talking quietly to his unlikely protector. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the rumble of thunder as the afternoon storms began building over the mountain peaks. Time was running short, and the window for a safe extraction was narrowing. He turned to Bear, seeing in the dog's steady gaze the same determination that had carried them through months of training and healing. They had come too far to fail now. "Ready for the most important rescue of our lives, boy." Bear's tail wagged once, sharp and certain. "Ready." Together, they began their careful descent into the clearing, where a lost boy waited to be found and an old debt waited to be paid, in the only currency that mattered, the safe return of a child to the arms of those who loved him. The first drops of rain began to fall as they reached the edge of the clearing, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains like the voice of the wilderness itself, calling them home. The approach required every skill Jed had learned in decades of mountain living combined with instincts Bear had been born with. They moved like ghosts through the undergrowth, each step calculated to avoid sudden sounds or movements that might alarm the bear. The rain had begun in earnest now, fat drops pattering against the leaves overhead and adding an element of urgency to an already tense situation. 20 feet from the clearing's edge, Jed stopped and assessed the scene one final time. The bear remained in her protective position, but her ears were constantly moving, tracking sounds that human senses couldn't detect. Tommy had noticed the rain and pulled his hood up, but he seemed remarkably calm for a child who had spent the night alone in the wilderness. "Okay, Bear," Jed whispered, his voice barely audible above the increasing rainfall. "This is going to require everything we've learned. I need you to be my eyes and ears." Bear's response was a subtle shift in posture, his body language communicating readiness and understanding. This dog, who had once been written off as too aggressive and damaged to train, was now about to attempt the most delicate rescue operation either of them had ever faced. Jed began moving forward, Bear beside him, both of them using the natural cover of fallen logs and dense ferns to mask their approach. The key was to make their presence known gradually, allowing the bear to assess them as non-threatening before they got close enough to pose any perceived danger to Tommy. When they were 15 feet away, Jed began speaking in the same low, conversational tone he'd heard Tommy use with the bear. "Easy, Mama," he said softly. "Nobody here wants to hurt anybody. We're just going to help the boy get home to his family." The bear's head swiveled toward them, her dark eyes taking in this new element in her carefully guarded situation. Her body tensed, but she didn't rise or show signs of immediate aggression. Instead, she seemed to be evaluating, trying to determine if these newcomers represented a threat to her charge. Tommy looked up at the sound of Jed's voice, his face breaking into a smile of relief that pierced Jed's heart like an arrow. "Are you here to take me home?" the boy asked, his voice carrying the particular mixture of bravery and fear that only children could manage. "That's the plan, son," Jed replied, still moving slowly forward. "But we need to make sure your friend here knows we're on the same side." The bear had risen to her feet now, not aggressively, but alert to the changing dynamics of the situation. She positioned herself between Tommy and the approaching humans, her massive form a living barrier that could become deadly in seconds if she perceived a threat. That's when Bear made his move. The dog separated from Jed, circling wide around the clearing's perimeter. But instead of approaching the bear directly, he began exhibiting submissive behaviors, lowering his head, moving in gentle curves rather than straight lines, even performing a playbow that canines used to signal peaceful intentions. "Smart boy," Jed murmured, recognizing Bear's strategy. The dog was communicating in a language the bear would understand, establishing himself as non-threatening while demonstrating his own protective instincts toward the child. The bear watched Bear's approach with obvious interest. Her posture remained alert but began to relax slightly as Bear's body language continued to signal peaceful intentions. When Bear settled onto his belly about 10 feet away from Tommy, the bear seemed to accept his presence as part of the protective circle rather than a threat to it. "Tommy," Jed said, continuing his own careful approach, "I need you to stay very calm and do exactly what I tell you, okay? Your mum and dad are very worried about you, and we're going to get you back to them." "Is my dad really worried?" Tommy asked, and something in his tone suggested that Marcus's concern might not always be so evident. "He was pretty mad when I wandered off." "He's not mad now," Jed assured him, and he found that he meant it. Whatever anger Marcus might have felt had been burned away by hours of terror and uncertainty. Right now, he just wants you safe. The rain was coming down harder now, and in the distance, Jed could hear the rumble of thunder growing closer. They needed to move soon, but rushing would be disastrous. The bear was accepting their presence, but any sudden movement could shatter the delicate balance they'd achieved. "Tommy, I'm going to come a little closer now," Jed said, taking another careful step forward. "If Mama Bear here seems upset, I'm going to stop and we'll wait a bit longer, but we need to get you out of this rain." The bear watched Jed's approach with the kind of focused attention that wild animals brought to potential threats. Her breathing was steady, her posture alert, but not aggressive. Most importantly, she wasn't vocalizing. No huffs or growls that would indicate escalating stress. 10 feet, 8 feet, 6 feet. Jed was close enough now that he could see the exhaustion in Tommy's eyes, the way the boy was fighting to stay. Brave despite being cold, wet, and probably hungry. Close enough to reach out and touch him if necessary. Close enough for the bear to strike if she decided these intruders had gotten too close to her charge. The moment of truth came when lightning split the sky overhead, followed immediately by a thunderclap that shook the forest floor. The sudden violence of the sound startled all of them. Tommy flinched, Bear's ears flattened against his head, and the bear rose to her full height, every instinct telling her to protect her charge from this new threat. For a heartbeat, disaster seemed inevitable. The bear's massive form towered over them all, her head swiveling between the humans and the storm above, trying to process too many potential dangers at once. Her breathing had quickened, and a low rumble emanated from deep in her chest. That's when Tommy did something that would stay with Jed for the rest of his life. The 8-year-old boy stood up slowly and placed his small hand on the bear's foreleg, looking up at her with the kind of fearless trust that only children possessed. "It's okay, Mama Bear," he said softly. "It's just thunder. The nice man is here to help me get home before the storm gets worse. You did good taking care of me, but you don't have to worry anymore." The bear looked down at the boy, and something passed between them that transcended species, a moment of understanding that reduced the complexity of the situation to its essential truth. This child needed to go home, and these humans were here to make that happen. Slowly, deliberately, the bear stepped back. Jed moved forward without hesitation, kneeling beside Tommy and quickly assessing him for injuries. The boy was cold and tired, but appeared unharmed. More importantly, he seemed remarkably calm for someone who had spent the night lost in the wilderness with a wild animal for company. "Are you hurt anywhere, Tommy?" Jed asked, his hands efficiently checking for obvious injuries while keeping one eye on the bear, who had retreated to the edge of the clearing but continued to watch them. "Just cold and hungry," Tommy replied, "and my feet hurt from walking. So much yesterday. Mama Bear kept me warm, though. She shared her den with me." Jed pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders, then activated his radio. "Command, this is Team 7. I have the subject. He's conscious, responsive, and appears uninjured. We're beginning extraction now." The relief in Captain Martinez's voice was audible even through the static. "Copy, Team 7. Outstanding work. Medical team is standing by at the staging area." "Tommy's father wants to speak with him," came Marcus's voice over the radio, thick with emotion. Jed handed the radio to Tommy, who took it with the serious expression children wore when handling important adult equipment. "Dad, it's me. I'm okay." The sob that came through the radio's speaker was raw and unguarded. "Tommy, oh God, Tommy, are you really okay? Are you hurt?" "I'm not hurt, Dad. I got lost, but this really nice bear took care of me all night. And now..." Tommy looked up at Jed questioningly. "Cain," Jed supplied. "Jed Cain. Mr. Cain and his dog are going to bring me home. His dog is really smart, Dad. He found me even though I was super lost. Just come home, son. We'll talk about everything when you get here." Another lightning flash illuminated the clearing, followed by thunder that seemed closer than before. The bear, still watching from the forest edge, huffed once and melted back into the trees as silently as she had appeared. Her job was done. "We need to move," Jed told Tommy, helping the boy to his feet. "The storm's getting worse, and we have a long walk back to where your parents are waiting." The extraction was methodical, but swift. Jed had marked their route carefully on the way in, and Bear proved invaluable in navigating back through the increasingly treacherous terrain. The rain had made the forest floor slippery, and more than once Jed found himself grateful for the dog's sure footing and ability to find the safest path. Tommy proved to be a tough little traveler, uncomplaining despite his obvious exhaustion. He chatted quietly as they walked, telling Jed about his night with the bear, about how she had led him to shelter when the rain started, about how she had shared her body heat to keep him warm. "She lost her cubs," Tommy said matter-of-factly, as they picked their way across a fallen log that bridged a rain-swollen creek. "That's why she wanted to take care of me. She was lonely too." The simple wisdom of that observation hit Jed like A physical blow, out of the mouths of babes. This child had understood something about the bear's motivations that had escaped all the adults involved in the rescue. "You're pretty smart for 8 years old," Jed said, steadying Tommy as they navigated a particularly tricky section of the trail. "My mum says I notice things other people miss," Tommy replied. "Is that why your dog found me? Because he notices things too?" Jed looked at Bear, who was scouting ahead with the focused dedication that had made him such an exceptional search. Animal. "Yeah, he notices things. We both do. Sometimes the things that hurt us most make us better at helping others." Through the trees ahead, Jed could see the lights of the staging area, could hear the voices of the search teams and the rumble of vehicles. In a few more minutes, Tommy would be back in his father's arms, safe and sound. The hardest part of the rescue was over, but Jed knew that in some ways the most difficult moments were still to come. The reunion between Tommy and his parents was everything Jed remembered from his own experience of nearly losing a child, raw, desperate, and beautiful. In its intensity, Marcus dropped to his knees as Tommy ran toward him, gathering his son into his arms with the kind of fierce protectiveness that only parents who had faced the possibility of loss could understand. Tommy's mother, a woman with kind eyes and worry. Lines that hadn't been there 24 hours earlier wrapped both of them in her embrace. Tears streaming down her face as she whispered prayers of gratitude into her son's hair. Jed stood apart from the reunion, Bear beside him, both of them watching the scene with the quiet satisfaction that came from a job well done. The medical team had pronounced Tommy healthy aside from minor dehydration and fatigue, and the boy was already regaling anyone who would listen with stories of his night with Mama Bear. Captain Martinez approached them, her usually stern expression softened by genuine admiration. "Exceptional work, both of you. That was as clean an extraction as I've ever seen under those conditions." Bear did most of the heavy lifting, Jed replied, scratching behind the dog's ears. "He's the one who found the trail and kept us on track. Don't sell yourself short. The way you handled that bear situation was textbook, patient, respectful, never forcing the issue. You've got real instincts for this work." Before Jed could respond, he saw Marcus approaching, Tommy's hand clasped firmly in his own. The man's face bore the weight of 15 years and a night of terror, but also something else. A resolution that hadn't been there before. "Jed," Marcus said when he reached them, his voice steady despite the emotion underneath. "I need to thank you. What you did today, you don't need to thank me," Jed interrupted. "It's what anyone would have done." "No," Marcus said firmly, "it's not, and we both know it. After what I did to your family, after what I took from you, you had every right to walk away. But you didn't. You risked your life to save my son." Tommy looked up at the two men, sensing the gravity of the conversation, even if he didn't understand its full context. "Mr. Cain, are you and my dad friends?" The innocent question hung in the air between them, highlighting the complexity of what had just transpired. Jed looked down at the boy, then back at Marcus, seeing in his face the same mixture of grief and hope that had haunted his own reflection for so many years. "Your dad and I have some history, Tommy," Jed said carefully. "Sometimes people hurt each other without meaning to, and it takes a long time to figure out how to move past that." "Like when I accidentally broke Mom's favorite vase?" Tommy asked, with the straightforward logic of childhood. "Something like that," Jed agreed, though they all knew it was infinitely more complicated. Marcus knelt beside his son, his hands resting on the boy's shoulders. "Tommy, I need you to understand something. A long time ago I made a terrible mistake that hurt Mr. Cain's family very badly. He had every reason to hate me, but today he saved you anyway. That's the kind of man he is," Tommy studied Jed with the serious expression children wore when trying to understand adult complexities. "Are you still sad about what happened to your family?" The directness of the question caught Jed off guard. In all the years since the accident, no one had ever asked him so simply, so honestly about his grief. "Yes," he said finally, I still miss them every day, but I've learned that being sad doesn't mean you can't also help other people. Sometimes helping others is the best way to honor the people we've lost." Tommy nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by stepping forward and wrapping his arms around Jed's waist in a fierce hug. "Thank you for saving me, and I'm sorry about your family." Jed felt something break open in his chest, a dam that had held back 15 years of carefully controlled emotion. He knelt and returned the boy's embrace, feeling the solid warmth of young life in his arms and remembering, for the first time, without pain, what it had felt like to hold his own son. When Tommy finally pulled back, he looked between Jed and Marcus with the earnest expression of a child trying to fix the adult world's complications. "Maybe you could come visit us sometime," he said to Jed. "I want to tell you more about Mama Bear, and maybe your dog could teach me stuff about finding things." Over Tommy's head, Jed's eyes met Marcus's. In that gaze, he saw not the careless young man who had destroyed his world, but a father who had just experienced his own brush with devastating loss. A man who understood, perhaps for the first time, the true weight of what he had taken from Jed so many years ago. "I'd like that," Jed said, and meant it. 3 months later, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Jed stood on his cabin porch, watching Bear work with a new search and rescue trainee, a young golden retriever who showed promise but still had much to learn about the patience and instincts required for wilderness work. The training program had expanded, and Jed found himself spending more time at the facility, working with other handlers and their dogs. He'd even begun taking speaking engagements, sharing his story of healing and second chances with groups who dealt with trauma and loss. His monthly trips to town had become weekly visits, and his friendship with Martha and Doc Henderson had deepened into something that felt like family. Dr. Winters had become a regular visitor to the mountain, checking on Bear's continued development and often staying for dinner and conversation. The cabin still held Dusty's grave under the pine tree, but it no longer felt like a shrine to loss. Instead, it had become part of a larger story, one that included Bear's arrival, their journey together, and the gradual understanding that love didn't have to end with death. In his pocket, Jed carried a new photograph, one taken at the search and rescue graduation ceremony, showing him and Bear receiving their official certification. But beside it, carefully preserved, was the old picture of Sarah and Danny. Both images told parts of his story, and both had their place in the life he was building. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in the colors of peace, Jed called Bear in from his training session. Together, they walked the perimeter of the property one last time, checking on their domain, as they had every evening for over a year now. But tonight, as they passed Dusty's grave, Jed didn't feel the familiar weight of loss. Instead, he felt gratitude for the love he had known, for the second chance he had found, and for the understanding that sometimes the most broken souls make the best healers. In the distance, an owl called to its mate, and Bear's ears perked forward at the sound. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help, new chances to prove that broken things could indeed be made whole. Tonight, though, was for peace, for companionship, and for the quiet satisfaction of a life lived in service to something larger than oneself.